Vernon and Loudon by Bob Marley. Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting from Hamburg, Germany, home to Der Spiegel, the largest circulation news magazine in Europe. After Barack Obama won the presidential election in the United States, Der Spiegel had him on its cover with the headline, "The World's President." Mathias Muller Von Blumencron is the editor-in-chief of Der Spiegel. He joins me now in Hamburg. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you very much for having me here.
It's very good to have you on, especially given today is the day you put your weekly to bed, so I know that you're in the midst of figuring out the headlines and the final stories, so thank you for coming on. Let's talk first about that magazine. We're broadcast on radio, on internet, and on television, and for our TV viewers, I want you to hold up the magazine when you announced President-elect Barack Obama. Talk about the title.
It was a very moving moment for everybody here in Germany. If Barack Obama would have been elected here, he would have gotten 75% of the vote, and even as I looked it up, 88% of the vote of the executives here in Germany. So
88%. So more than of the general population of the executives. You mean the corporate executives?
Corporate executives. They would have elected him by 88%.
Why?
So by a big margin. There is big hope. There is big excitement about change, about his motto, change. We called him on this cover the world's president, because we followed this election basically as it would have been a German election very intensely. We did 5-6 cover stories on that election campaign alone in this year. So our people were very familiar with the issues, and they were there was a very big attention for this, first for the pre-election and afterwards for the real election. Everybody was hoping that he would win.
Why is this? And maybe you could show us some of your other covers to give an indication of how people felt. I see two right there. One with
We had one which basically shows what I would say we exaggerate a little bit on the cover, but I think that's allowed. This is called the Bush Warriors, and means end of the show. We had, in the middle of his term, we had this cover with the Bush Warriors, but they were very powerful figures. And now, 4 years later, 5 years later, it's after the war, after their term, and they look beaten up.
As a Rambo-like figure next to Dick Cheney, next to Condoleezza Rice. But their weapons are now, they're leaning on them, their clothes are ripped, they're bloody and wounded.
Rumsfeld is running out already.
Oh, Rumsfeld, I didn't even see his face.
He left already. So it is a very funny, it is a bitter, it's certainly a little bit cynical look on that term, but we have covered the results of this presidency very intensely, and we agree with many of the American experts that this probably was not one of the hottest presidential terms in U.S. history, and contrary, it was probably one of the worst.
You had a breaking story this summer when you went to Baghdad, Matthias, and interviewed the president, interviewed Maliki. Talk about what he said.
We sat down with Mr. Maliki for around about an hour and discussed various topics of politics. And of course, the American, the future of the American troops in Iraq was a big topic, and he has written an editorial, an opinion piece of Barack Obama, which had appeared in the New York Times a couple of days earlier. In this piece, Obama had outlined his ideas, and he said, within 16 months, we will start to withdraw from Iraq. And al-Maliki mentioned that by himself and said, that sounds about right. We like that plan. And we immediately, when we were sitting in this interview, knew this is a very interesting quote. We translated that interview afterwards in English, as we do with many of our pieces from the magazine, and posted it on our international website, which you can reach under www.spiegel.de/international. And so it was immediately picked up by American English-speaking wires and also by the American press, and caused a huge stir because it looked like as al-Maliki was endorsing Barack Obama. He explicitly said in the interview he's not endorsing Barack Obama, but anyway, it showed a certain sympathy for that plan, and that made a very big splash in US media. And later on, we were approached by the New York Times, which they wanted to know how the real wording was, and we played them the tapes, and it was as he had said.
Now, when people asked you to put the interview on the website, you chose not to, but said you'd play it for anyone on the telephone?
Exactly.
Why did you choose to do that?
Well, I mean, an interview conversation is like an hour, and we are not, we don't do an agreement with our peers that we put this interview unedited on the web. That's just not our policy. When we do an interview for the print edition, we do an interview for the print edition, and it will be put out in a printed form and not in the original voicing. That's just our policy. If we would do otherwise, we would have to agree before with our partners.
I'm looking at another of your magazines, Der Spiegel, the cover that has the U.S. dollar on it, and you've got a bullet in George Washington's head. Explain this. What is the title in English?
I don't know.
What is it in German?
In German, it is Das Kapitalverbrechen, which means like a very severe crime, capital crime, and the subline is Anatomy of a World Crisis, which just have begun. And this was an intensively researched story. 5-6 people worked for over a month on that story and showed how the financial crisis evolved in the early 90s, middle of the 90s. I mean, the roots were laid in the middle of the 90s, and then how the exaggeration in the credit market and so on became bigger and bigger and bigger, and at the end led to this huge bubble which now imploded. It was the longest cover story the magazine ever printed. It was on 25 pages, which is unusual for a weekly, but we thought it is an unusual time, and an unusual time needs unusual explanation. It is very difficult for the people out there to understand this crisis and what really happened there, and you have to explain it in a very how should I say, in an elaborate way, in an interesting way. Otherwise, they lose interest. And it's so important that people are not losing interest in the mechanism of this crisis and in the groundwork of this crisis.
Can you explain how it's affected Germany, and also how you're covering what's happening in the United States, the views of Der Spiegel on the bailout of $700 billion for the banks? The auto industry then comes to ask for a bailout, and the question is, what's your plan? How are you going to spend this? So the banks were never asked this question.
We are in a different situation here in Germany than you in the US. We didn't have a credit bubble because the Germans save so much, because they are so careful people. If you would word it a little bit more negative. They are very risk-averse people, but prudent. So we didn't have a real estate bubble. We didn't have a real estate boom. Germany was one of the few countries in Europe where the real estate prices stayed constant for the last couple